The oldest stories we have, they're not exactly what we think. Every epic myth, whether it's the Odyssey or the Dreamtime, there's a layer inside it, a practical one. A true one. These stories, they encoded real paths, human migration paths. They were navigation systems, the original ones for our species. So by the end of this, you won't see mythology as fiction. You'll see it as a technology, a brilliant one, sophisticated, built for survival. Take a tale about a hero and a monster. How did that preserve directions? Across 1,000 miles of wilderness or cultures on opposite sides of the planet, why do they tell such similar stories about great floods, wandering stars? The answers, they rewrite the past. They show us our ancestors wove the world into narrative, landscapes, star patterns. They turned them into legends. Unforgettable ones. What kind of map might be hidden in your favorite old story? A story is like a biological hard drive. Before writing, before maps, before any kind of external memory, there was this huge problem. How do you store the most important information a group has? Not for a year, for 100 years, for 1,000. The answer was to weave that data right into a story. Survival data, where to find a hidden spring that only flows in a drought, the safe path through a mountain pass, the one that avoids the cliff, the specific star that comes up when a certain berry is ripe. This wasn't just folklore, it was a compression algorithm, taking gigabytes of environmental knowledge and turning it into a file you could remember. A file you could pass on, a story. Researchers have a name for this, ethnogeography. It's how cultures encode their physical world into their culture. A mountain isn't just a rock, it's the resting place of a giant turned to stone. A bend in a river is where a hero fought a serpent. A cluster of stars is the ancestors' campfire. You give a place a name and a story, and it becomes unforgettable. You turn geography into mythology. Every landmark is a chapter. Every journey is retracing an old tale. So when an elder told the story of the rainbow serpent moving across the land, it wasn't just a myth. It was a data transfer. The serpent's body curving along, that was the winding path of a real river. Where it stopped and made waterholes, those were real oases, life-saving places. The story compressed the map into a sequence of events, into characters, into emotional beats. A child hears it and remembers the fight with the sun. An adult heading out on a journey hears that same part and knows, turn left at the Twin Hills, travel to the sandstone outcrop, find water there. The oral tradition was this self-correcting system. Every time the story was told, the core data had to be right. The waypoints, the resources. If it was wrong, the consequences were real. A misremembered story could send people into a dead end, into a desert. So the narrative, the monsters and the heroes and the lessons, all of that was like an error-checking code. It made the vital information too compelling to forget, too sacred to change. The land became the library, and every myth was a living guidebook, passed down not on parchment but in the rhythm of speech. The night sky was the first map. Every culture put its instructions there in the stars, but astronomy on its own is complex. It's just these shifting points of light. So our ancestors did something. They gave those points names. They gave them families and epic dramas. They turned the cosmos into a story you could follow. There's Orion, the hunter. He's chased forever by the scorpion. That's not just a random myth. It's a clock. In the Mediterranean, when Scorpius rises in the east, Orion starts to set in the west. That event in the sky marks a turn in the seasons. For sailors, for herders, that story held a message. The scorpion rising meant changing weather. It meant the end of a sailing season or the movement of game. You didn't need coordinates. You just remembered the hunter was running from the scorpion. When you saw that chase overhead, you knew it was time to move. This pattern is everywhere. Maybe the most universal story is the Pleiades. To the Greeks, they were the 7 sisters, daughters of Atlas, placed in the sky. To Aboriginal Australians, they were sisters being chased by a man in Orion. To the Maori, they were Matariki, a cluster that signaled the new year. The characters change, but the function of the story is the same. The heliacal rising of the Pleiades when they first appear before dawn is a precise marker. In Greece, it meant the start of sailing. In many places, it was time to plant. The myth of the sisters packaged that astronomical event into a narrative. You teach a child that story, the sisters fleeing or appearing, and you've taught them a calendar. That's how you navigate by mythology. Polynesian voyagers, the greatest open ocean navigators, they didn't just use stars as points, they used the stories. The whole Pacific was charted through star paths, where constellations were remembered as ancestors, as gods, as guiding spirits. A navigator wouldn't just aim for a star. He would follow the path of the hero Maui. He would track the great bird of prey whose wings pointed to islands. The sky became a storybook of routes. By personifying the heavens, they created a navigation system. It was durable, it didn't fade, it didn't get lost, it was retold around fires for generations. So when you look up and recognize a constellation, you're not just seeing stars, you're reading a page from an ancient guidebook, one that told civilizations when to journey and where to go. The map wasn't only in the sky, it was in the ground. The land itself holds old stories, geological events, huge ones. They become pillars of memory, a flood that covers everything. A mountain that rises overnight, a canyon cut by a giant spear. These aren't just metaphors, they're likely memories, real, cataclysmic changes to the landscape that our ancestors saw and survived. Take the Great Flood. That story is everywhere. Mesopotamia, the Americas, Greece, indigenous Australia. For a long time, it was seen as myth, a shared lesson. But it could be a record. About 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. Glaciers melted on a continental scale. Sea levels rose over 300 feet. Coastlines drowned, whole plains vanished. Doggerland, between Britain and Europe, went under the waves. For generations living through that, it would have seemed like the world was flooding. The water kept coming, season after season, swallowing hunting grounds, forests, hills. That trauma, that reshaping of the world, would be the most important story to tell. Where we used to live, why we moved here, the path to safety. The flood myth, in its forms, might be our oldest travel log. It encodes the memory of a migration. Forced by a changing planet, and the land wasn't just a backdrop, it became the main character. There's the Aboriginal Dreamtime story of the 3 sisters. That rock formation in Australia's Blue Mountains. The tale says 3 sisters from the Katoomba tribe fell in love with 3 brothers from another tribe, which was forbidden. A battle happened. A witch doctor turned the sisters to stone to protect them. He meant to reverse the spell later, but he died, so they remain watching over the valley. This isn't just a charming legend to explain a shape. For the Gundungurra and Darug peoples, that story anchors the formation in their lore and their geography. It makes the landmark unforgettable. It tells you who you are, where you are, what happened there. For people moving through that terrain, the 3 sisters weren't just a navigation point. They were a story you reached. When you saw them, you knew you were on the right path, in the right territory. You were walking through a living narrative. This is how geology becomes genealogy. A spring might be the tears of an ancestor. A bend in a river is where a creator being rested. A strange, isolated mountain is a giant turned to stone for breaking a law. These stories do something. They turn a random, impersonal landscape into a place of meaning and memory. They encode practical information. That spring is safe to drink from. That mountain pass is treacherous, avoid it. But they also encode the history of the people. The path of a creator being's journey across the land often mirrors the actual migration route the tribe took over centuries. The story preserves the sequence of stopping points, the challenges, the resources found. The land becomes a mnemonic device, a vast, open-air library where every feature holds a chapter. You don't read this map with your eyes alone. You read it with the stories passed down from the oldest among you. To walk the land is to recite its history. To know a place is to know its story, and in knowing that story, you always know the way home. The Pacific is this huge, empty space, 2/3 of the planet. Just blue, and yet people found every piece of land out there. They crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, in canoes, no compasses, no charts. They did it by reading stories. The story of Maui, the trickster, that's the master key. In the myth, Maui goes fishing with his brothers. He has this magic fishhook, and he doesn't catch a fish. He pulls up whole islands from the deep. To an outsider, it's a creation tale. To a Polynesian navigator, it was a technical manual. The story encodes the whole idea of wayfinding. That land exists beyond the horizon, waiting, that you need cunning and skill, like Maui, to bring it into the world. But the myth gets specific. When it says Maui followed the birds, that's not just poetry. It's an instruction. Certain seabirds, like the monu oku, they fly out to sea to fish all day, but they always go back to land at night. So by watching their flight at dusk, a navigator could plot a course to an island he couldn't even see. The myth embeds that fact into a narrative. You remember Maui watching the birds, and you remember to do it. Then there's the wave law. The open ocean isn't featureless. It has a texture. Long, deep ocean swells, they roll for thousands of miles. When they approach an island, they bend, they refract, they create a specific, choppy pattern in the water. A master navigator could lie down in the canoe, feel the boat's motion, and read that pattern like a map. That deep knowledge of wave piloting, it's woven right into the Maui stories. The tales describe the sea's mood, its resistance. They teach you to feel the ocean, not just look at it. Maybe the most precise code is in the story of Hina and the eel. In that myth, the goddess Hina is chased by an eel. When the eel is defeated, its head is buried and the first coconut tree grows, but a key part is Hina escaping. She causes fresh water to mix with the sea. For a sailor dying of thirst, that's the clue. It tells you to watch for a discoloration in the water, a lens of brown or green spreading from the shore. That's the outflow of a river or a lagoon mixing with the salt water. It means land is near and fresh water is there. The myth turns a survival signal into a story about a romantic pursuit. This wasn't just a collection of stories, it was a living curriculum. Young navigators in training, they didn't just memorize star positions, they memorized the epics. The adventures of Maui, the travels of Hina, inside those narratives were all the protocols, the star to steer by when you set out, the bird to watch for after 10 days. The feel of the waves when an island is 100 miles to the south. The myth was the container. It held the data, kept it in order, and made it sacred. It made the knowledge too important to forget. Each voyage was a reenactment. The navigator wasn't just sailing. He was walking in the footsteps of the gods, pulling islands from the sea again. The story was the map and the compass and the reason for going. Animals knew the way first. Their instincts made these highways long before we saw them. And our ancestors, they watched. They didn't just watch, they turned what they saw into stories. A caribou herd moving like water, a whale's song along a coast. Geese in a V across the sky, these were signs, and to remember the signs, they became legends, like the thunderbird. In a lot of native traditions, it's this giant raptor. Its wings make thunder, its eyes flash lightning. On one level, that's a storm, but the stories, they tie it to something else, to the migrations, geese, cranes, eagles. When those flocks moved, the thunderbird was there. It wasn't just causing the storm, it was marking the moment. The The story connected the thunder, the birds in the sky, and the food coming. The salmon running, the bison moving, you hear that story and you know it's time to go, to follow. The animal's path became the spirit's path, and then it became the people's path. This idea, it's everywhere. In Siberia, living meant knowing where the reindeer went. The stories there talk about spirit guides, great stags. They'd come to a shaman in a dream. And the dream wasn't just a feeling, it was a map, a white stag crossing a river at a certain bend. That meant the herd would cross there when the ice was right. So the shamanic tradition, it took the animal's instinct and made it a story, a sacred narrative. The reindeer became a guiding spirit, and the migration route became a journey to remember. It's a simple principle. Animals are good at surviving. They find the water, the safe passes, the grass. By watching them, our ancestors got these routes already tested. And by making the animals into characters, the wise whale, the butterfly that travels continents, they made sure the knowledge would last longer than any one person. The monarch butterfly going from Canada to Mexico, for ancient people that must have seemed impossible. A story about that butterfly becomes a story about a long journey. About faith, it reinforces moving with the season, following a path because the one who made it is so sure. These myths, they did more than give directions. They made a relationship. Following the caribou wasn't just using a resource, it was walking with a guide, playing a part in a very old story. The land wasn't empty then. It was full of stories, each one tied to a creature's movement. Know the myth of the whale and you know the coastal route. Tell the tale of the bear and you remember which valley when the berries are out. They didn't just borrow the paths, they entered a partnership, a narrative one, where every trip was a retelling and every time you told it, you remembered the way home. You keep a map alive for 1,000 years by walking it, by making the journey itself a sacred act. That's how mythology moves off the page. It moves into the footsteps of millions through ritual journeys, through pilgrimages, and these aren't just spiritual exercises. Often, they're the literal retracing of ancient, encoded migration paths. A pilgrimage route is a memory performed by the body. Take the Hindu journey to the source of the Ganges. Pilgrims travel to Gomukh, the cow's mouth, a glacier high in the Himalayas. The myth says the goddess Ganga descended from heaven to earth. Her flow was caught in the matted hair of the god Shiva to keep her force from shattering the world. And to walk that path from the plains up into those mountains is to follow the story of her descent in reverse. You're tracing the narrative upstream, and scholars note that narrative aligns almost perfectly with ancient trade routes into the Himalayas. The stops along the way, the sacred sites, they aren't random. They mark the old resting places, the safe fords, the points where valleys met. The myth encoded the practical route. The pilgrimage reanimates it, generation after generation. Every step a pilgrim takes reinforces the path. It keeps the knowledge of the terrain current. It binds the community to a landscape defined by story. But perhaps the most profound system is the Aboriginal songlines. This is mythology as a living GPS. A songline is the story of a creator being's journey during the dreamtime. As that ancestor walked and sang and fought, every feature of the land came into being. A rock, a waterhole, a mountain, each is a stanza in an epic song. To know the songline is to know the route across hundreds of miles of desert, but you don't just know it, you sing it. As you walk the land, you sing the verses for the landmarks you pass. The song acts as both a map and a title deed. It describes the turns, the resources, the dangers. If you sing the song correctly, you cannot get lost. You are walking the melody of creation, and this ritual journey isn't a one-time pilgrimage. It's a continuous act of law-keeping and navigation. Spiritual practice blended with practical geography in a perfect, unbroken loop. By singing the story, you maintain the world. You keep the knowledge alive and functional. That's the secret. A story written on a page can be forgotten. A story etched into the stars requires an astronomer, but a story that is walked and sung and ritualized becomes part of the rhythm of life itself. The Camino de Santiago in Spain follows old Roman roads. Medieval trade routes, paths worn by countless feet long before they were called sacred. The routes to Mecca were woven through desert tracks and oasis networks that predate Islam by centuries. These ritual journeys fossilize the old ways of moving. They turn survival paths into paths of meaning. Every pilgrim, every singer walking a songline is doing two things at once. They are seeking spiritual connection, and they are unconsciously rehearsing the very routes their ancestors used to find water and safety and home. The map is remembered not because it is studied, but because it is lived. The journey becomes the story's battery, charging it with new life every time it is performed. So a long pilgrimage is more than faith. It's a culture walking its oldest, most vital map. Keeping the directions alive one step at a time, 500 cultures have a story about the same event, a flood that ends the world. That number is too large to ignore. It suggests a shared memory, something real embedded deep in our stories. For people living at the end of the last ice age, the world didn't just shift. It was swallowed, the glaciers melted, and the seas rose more than 300 feet. That's like a 30-story building of water. Coastlines moved back for miles. Whole places where people had lived for generations just gone, underwater. The North Sea, for instance, it was a plain once, Doggerland with forests and rivers. Now it's at the bottom of the sea, and that loss, it wasn't slow. It happened within a single human lifetime. The water just kept rising year after year. Consuming the familiar world, the flood myths we know, like Noah or Gilgamesh, they aren't really about the water. They're about navigation. They're survival guides for a planet that's coming apart. The instruction is always the same: build a boat, collect what matters, and aim for high ground. Noah making a list of animals, that's not just a storybook detail. It's a metaphor for taking your whole ecosystem with you, for preserving life. The ark is the vehicle for migration. It's a command to move, to adapt, to abandon the old map because it doesn't work anymore. The mountain where it lands, Ararat, that's the symbol. Find the high point, find the new land. The myth takes an ordeal that lasted generations and compresses it into one story. These stories hold the panic of a vanishing coast, the fear of watching your home ground disappear, but they also hold the answer. They turn trauma into a manual. The Greek story of Deucalion follows the same pattern. A flood from Zeus, a warning, a chest built for survival, a mountain. After the water goes down, Deucalion and his wife are told to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulder. They decide that means stones, the bones of the earth, and the stones become new people. That's a metaphor for repopulation. After the disaster, it's about starting over. Taking the land itself and making a new community from it. The myth isn't just a record of the flood, it's a blueprint for what to do next, how to rebuild. So when we hear these stories from everywhere, we're not hearing a made-up tale, we're hearing an echo, the echo of real coastlines falling into the sea. Of real people gathering what they could carry and moving inland, moving uphill, following the animals, looking for that new mountain. The story itself became the vessel. It carried the memory of that journey. It told the next generations this happened. The world can change, and when it does, here is how you live through it. Build your ark, go to the high place, take the seeds of your world with you. The flood myth might be our oldest map, a map that doesn't show you a location. It shows you a method for when the ground beneath you is taken away. Words are fossils of movement, a language spreads, and it doesn't travel alone. It carries its stories inside it like seeds. And if you trace where a certain myth appears, you can sometimes see the path our ancestors walked. That's linguistic archaeology. You're digging not into soil, but into the syllables of old tales. Take the story of the divine twins. In Roman myth, they're Romulus and Remus, the founders of the city. In ancient India, they're the Ashvins, twin horsemen who bring healing and the dawn. You find echoes in Norse legends, in Baltic folklore. These aren't coincidences. The names for these twin gods in different Indo-European languages, they all come from the same ancient root. So the story itself was a piece of luggage. It was carried by the first speakers of Proto-Indo-European when they migrated out of their homeland, which was likely the steppes north of the Black Sea. Those people moved west to Europe and south to India over thousands of years. Their languages changed and split, but the core myth of the twins, the rescuers, the founders, it remained. It adapted. In Rome, they became babies raised by a wolf. In India, they became celestial physicians, but the blueprint is the same. So by mapping where this twin myth appears, you can trace a cultural migration. The story becomes a tracer die, showing the flow of people. This method works because myths are built from words, and words for sacred things, they're deeply conservative. A community might adopt a new word for a wheel or a sword from their neighbors, but the old, sacred words for gods, for heroes, for creation, those are held close. They're cultural anchors, so when you find a set of similar myths across a family of languages, you're probably looking at a shared inheritance from a time before those languages split. You're looking at the mythology of the proto-people. The Austronesian expansion is another clear map. This language family spread from Taiwan across the Pacific and Indian Oceans all the way to Madagascar. And sailing with those languages was the epic story of the great navigator, often a figure like Maui. The details change from island to island, but the core narrative, fishing up land, stealing fire, slowing the sun, these are too specific to be invented independently everywhere. They were carried in the canoes, in the songs of the voyagers. The myth was part of the navigational toolkit. So by studying the variations in the Maui cycle across Polynesia, you can hypothesize the sequence of the migration. Which version is oldest, which elements changed when they reached new islands with new animals. The story itself records the journey. This turns every old tale into a potential cipher. A strange place name in a legend might preserve the word for a mountain from a lost homeland. A description of a ritual might encode the climate of an ancestral region. When linguists compare different versions of a myth, they look for these frozen fragments. The original word for oak tree or salmon or winter snow tucked into a line about a god's challenge. If that word only makes sense in an ecological context far from where the story is now told, it's a clue. It suggests the story remembers a place the people left behind. So mythology isn't just a collection of fanciful tales, it's the narrative layer of human migration. The plot lines moved with the people, bending and adapting to new landscapes, but always holding the memory of the old ones. The epic of a people is, in a real sense, the story of their journey, and sometimes to find out where they went, you just have to listen carefully to the tale. The Aeneid was written as a national epic for Augustus. It's a poem for an empire, but the stories inside it are older. They're stories of refugees, a long sea journey. A Destiny in Italy, this wasn't just propaganda. It was taking older oral traditions and putting them into a literary form. Aeneas leaves Troy with his father on his back. He's carrying his household gods. That image is the refugee story, carrying your elders, carrying what's sacred, carrying your identity to a new place. His voyage across the Mediterranean has specific stops: Carthage, Sicily, Cumae. These were real ports, real points on ancient maritime maps, centers of trade and colonization. The path of the epic follows the actual routes sailors used: Greek routes, Phoenician routes, the same networks Rome would later control. The journey traces those highways on the water. Then there's the prophecy. The gods tell Aeneas he'll know his new home when he eats his tables. It sounds like a riddle. Years later, after landing in Italy, his people are starving. They use flatbread as plates. They eat the food, then they eat the plates, the tables, and he understands this is the place. Why put such a strange detail in a story? It's a location marker, an unforgettable one. It takes a geographical decision where to settle and ties it to a single, bizarre event. No one forgets the story of the day they ate their tables. That story anchors the founding of the city to that exact spot. It turns a practical choice about land and water into an act of fate. That's how migration memories survive. They get wrapped in a story of divine will. The tale says Aeneid was always destined for Italy, that his journey was fated. That narrative is powerful for a new nation. It gives them an ancient pedigree, a link to the Trojan War, but underneath that it probably preserves a real history, groups from the Eastern Mediterranean. Survivors from the collapse of Bronze Age palaces, sailing west, making stops, making alliances, sometimes conflict, like with Dido in Carthage, eventually negotiating with local tribes, the Latins, to settle down. The Aeneid takes that messy, generations-long process, migration, diplomacy, settlement, and compresses it into one man's quest. It turns multiple groups into a single lineage. But the skeleton of the story fits: the sea route, the key stopping points, the final integration with local people. It fits the pattern of how cultures moved and mixed in the ancient world. So a myth made for political unity can still be a vessel. It carries inside it the older, grittier truths of how people actually got there. The story of eating the tables isn't just a miracle. It's a landmark, a story stone placed on the map, saying, here, this is where we decided to stay. The hero's journey is a map for the soul, but it's also a map for the tribe. Joseph Campbell's monomyth, that pattern of departure, initiation, and return. It's not just a psychological transformation. It's the physical and social journey of a successful migration. The ultimate survival story. You have to leave the known world, your village, your homeland. You cross a threshold into the wilderness, a place of trials. Monsters to face, allies to find, a deep ordeal to survive. And if you succeed, you return with a boon, a gift to rebuild your home. That narrative arc is the template for countless epics because it was the template for countless real journeys. Take the Odyssey, it's the perfect case. Odysseus leaves his known world, Troy. He enters a decade of trials in the wilderness of the sea, but those trials aren't random fantasies. They're coded lessons in ancient navigation, the island of the Lotus Eaters where his men forget their purpose. That's a warning about losing your way. Not just physically, but in your mind, staying focused on the goal. The monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis guarding a narrow strait. That's a sailor's tale about a real, treacherous passage. Likely the Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily. The story encodes the choice. Do you risk losing a few to the monster on the cliff, or risk everyone to the whirlpool? It's a brutal navigational calculation turned into a myth. Even Circe, the witch who turns men into swine. On one level, it's a story about temptation. Losing your humanity. On a practical level, it could be a memory of a place where sailors succumbed to illness or a strange plant and never returned to their ships. Every episode is a potential waypoint, a hazard, a piece of environmental knowledge. The hero's path through these challenges is a masterclass in how to traverse a dangerous world and come out alive. The ultimate goal is always return and reintegration. Odysseus doesn't just go home to rest, he returns to reclaim his place, to reorder his household, to re-establish his community. That's the final, crucial stage of migration. It's not enough to find new land. You have to build a new home. You have to integrate the lessons from the journey into the foundation of your new society. The hero brings back the boon. For a migrating people, that boon isn't a golden fleece. It's the knowledge of a safe route, the memory of where the fresh water is. The alliance forged with a tribe you met along the way. The story packages that hard-won knowledge as a legendary treasure, making it sacred, unforgettable. So when a community faced the terrifying prospect of leaving everything behind, they didn't just have a plan. They had a story. The elder would recount the epic of the great hero who faced the same journey. The tale would outline the stages. It would warn of the specific dangers symbolized by monsters. It would promise that after the ordeal, a new home awaited. The narrative provided a psychological roadmap. It said this hardship has a structure, this fear has a name, this loneliness is part of the path, and it ends. The hero's journey myth gave people a role to play. They weren't just refugees or wanderers. They were heroes on a quest, following in the footsteps of gods and ancestors. Their personal suffering was given meaning, framed as an initiation necessary to earn their new place in the world. The story was the compass that kept them oriented, not just toward a geographical destination, but toward a narrative conclusion, a promised return, a home rebuilt. It turned the chaos of migration into a story they were living. And in doing so, it showed them the way through. There was one language for everyone. That's how the Babel story starts, a time when everyone could understand each other. They built a city and a tower meant to reach the sky. Then the divine response came to confuse their speech, to scatter them, so they couldn't understand each other anymore. On the surface, it's an origin story for different languages, but from a migration perspective, it reads differently. It reads like a memory, a compressed memory of a real human event. The Neolithic Revolution, when people moved from hunting and gathering to farming, in places like the Fertile Crescent, settled agriculture caused populations to boom. For the first time, there were more people than the land could support. Groups had to split off, they had to leave, they migrated outward in all directions, carrying their seeds, their animals, their words. Over generations, as these daughter communities traveled hundreds of miles, settling in new valleys, new climates, their single original language began to change. It splintered, dialects formed, then became mutually unintelligible languages. The people who once understood each other perfectly now sounded like strangers. From the viewpoint of those left in the homeland, remembered later, it would have seemed exactly like a scattering, a divine fracturing of a once unified people. The tower itself, that ambition, might symbolize the stability of early urban civilization, the first cities like Jericho with their impressive structures. A new way of living together. The myth suggests that from this pinnacle of unity came diversity. It captures a bittersweet truth. Progress and cohesion in one place lead to dispersal elsewhere. It explains why your distant cousins over the mountain range now speak a tongue you can't comprehend. The story encodes the feeling of that loss, the loss of common understanding, while recording the fact of our spread. It turns the slow process of linguistic drift into a single, dramatic moment, a divine intervention that makes it unforgettable. It answers the child's question of why we are different with a story that also explains how we came to be everywhere. Other cultures have similar myths. The Aztecs spoke of ancestors emerging from the 7 caves of Chicomostoc, then dispersing to found different city-states. That, too, is a memory of migration from a common origin, a narrative anchor for why related peoples live apart. These stories serve a function. They acknowledge separation and difference, but root that difference in a shared beginning. We may not understand each other now, but we were once one people. We came from the same place. We built the same tower. So the story of Babel doesn't just explain division. It maps the human journey from a center point out into the wide, waiting world. It's a legend of diaspora written in the language of myth. The proof can be in the ground. For a long time, Troy was just a story, a myth from Homer. Then a man named Heinrich Schliemann decided to look for it. He had a copy of the Iliad and a lot of determination. And he found it. He found the city, layers of it, right where the poem said it would be. That changed things. It meant a story told for thousands of years could be a real guide. A map to a lost place. That's where archaeology meets myth. They're reading the same map. One version is in words, the other is in the soil. There are the Viking sagas. They talked about sailing west past Greenland to a place called Vinland, a place with grapes and soft winters. People thought those were just adventure tales. Exaggerations. Then, in the 1960s, archaeologists used those same stories. They looked at the clues in the sagas, and they found Elant's Ox Meadows in Newfoundland. A small Norse camp, the kind of base the stories described, so the sagas weren't fiction. They were like logs, records of a real crossing. The details about the coast, the resources, they were good enough. Good enough to lead right to the spot. Even sharper evidence comes from the Pacific. Polynesian oral histories tell the order of finding islands. First Samoa, then the Marquesas, then Tahiti, then Hawaii and New Zealand. That was their history. But how do you check a timeline that's only in stories? The answer was the Pacific rat. These rats weren't from those islands. They came with the voyagers in the canoes. When people landed, the rats got out, and they left bones behind. Scientists took ancient rat bones from across the Pacific. They looked at the DNA. The genetic family tree of those rats showed a sequence, and that sequence matched the oral histories almost perfectly. The story and the science told the same journey. These aren't just confirmations, they show how closely people watch the world. If a myth says a mountain looks like a crouching lion, there's often a mountain that does. If a saga says to sail for 9 days with a star to the left, that's a real bearing. The truth inside these stories is often a place, its coordinates wrapped in a narrative. For an archaeologist, that story is a starting point, a hypothesis. The story says people came from the east, following a river of stars, so you look east along an old riverbed. The legend says the first village was where an eagle dropped a stone, so you look for the oldest settlement there. The myth gives the clues, the trowel tests them. This partnership changes history. It makes it less a list of dates and more an epic, a story we're still figuring out. When a dig site lines up with a legend, it's not just proof. It's a conversation. The past is speaking in its oldest language, the language of myth, and we're starting to understand the directions it's been giving us. A story about a tree can be a map to water. In survival, the most important information wasn't about monsters. It was about the next drink, the next meal. So our ancestors did something. They took those critical resources and made them holy. They wove them right into their sacred stories. A magical grove, a healing spring, a world tree. These aren't just fantasy. They're an encoded memory, a memory of where life was sustained. The Norse knew this. Their entire cosmos was held together by Yggdrasil, this immense ash tree. Its roots reached into different worlds, its branches held the heavens. On one level, that's a cosmological model, but from a migration perspective, it reads like a diagram. A central, resource-rich homeland, a fertile region that supported life, and from that trunk the branches extend out. Those could be the migration routes. The paths groups took when they left that central place. The tree isn't just connecting worlds, it's charting a family tree of movement. Every branch is a remembered journey from a common source. The story makes sure you never forget where you came from, the root of everything. Then there are the springs. Countless myths tell of a hero or a goddess causing a spring to burst from a rock. The Greek nymph Arethusa pursued was turned into a sacred spring. In so many traditions, a spring is where a revelation happens, where a god speaks. Why? Because in the ancient world, finding a new, reliable source of fresh water wasn't just lucky, it was miraculous. It meant the difference between life and a journey's end. By marking that event with a divine story, you do two things. First, you make the location unforgettable. You don't just say there's water near the big gray stone. You say that here the goddess struck the earth with her staff and life poured out. That story gets told and retold. Second, and just as important, you protect it. By making a resource sacred, you place a taboo around it. It's not just a utility, it's a shrine that discourages overuse or pollution or claiming it for one family alone. It becomes a communal treasure maintained by story. We see this in the sacred groves, from India to West Africa to pre-Christian Europe. These were often patches of ancient forest, preserved not by law but by myth. The story said the gods lived there or that spirits guarded the trees. That narrative protection kept the grove intact. It preserved biodiversity. It protected watersheds. It maintained a microclimate. The myth was an early environmental conservation policy. It encoded the knowledge that this place must not be touched for the health of all. So when a migrating group entered a new valley, the first act was to find water and food. And when they found it, they didn't just mark it on a stick. They sang it into a legend. That bend in the river where the salmon run thick, that's where the salmon people offered themselves to the hungry hero. That lone, fruit-bearing tree in the grassland. That's the tree of life planted by the first ancestor. These stories transform geography. They make it a sacred geography. Every essential resource becomes a node in a story network. A spiritual waypoint on the mental map. The land is no longer a collection of features. It is a narrative of sustenance. To know the stories is to know where the life is. And that is the most important map of all. A list is fragile, it's just information. A story is alive, it has a pulse. That's the psychological genius of those ancient maps. An instruction to follow a river for 3 days is a fact. It lives in one part of the mind, but a story about the river spirit, tricked by a clever rabbit, now flowing laughing toward the sea, that lives everywhere. It lives in your memory of the rabbit's cunning. It lives in the sound of the water which seems to chuckle. It lives in the lesson about respecting nature. That story creates a web in your brain. Emotion, imagery, sound, lesson. It's not one hook to remember, it's a dozen. If you forget the river's length, you remember the spirit's journey. If you forget the spirit, you remember the rabbit's triumph. The narrative is redundant by design. It builds a safety net for the data inside. This is why raw data dies, but stories evolve. Think of a game of telephone with a list. Big rock, left, river, 3 days. By the 10th person, it's small rock, right, stream, 2 days. The information corrupts because there's nothing to hold its shape. Now play telephone with the story of the stone giant. The 10th person might change the trickster's name or the color of the giant's eyes, but the core remains. A giant turned to stone lies by the river. The landmark is preserved because it's welded to a plot. The plot gives it meaning, and meaning makes it stick. Our brains are wired for narrative, not for spreadsheets. We remember the emotional arc, the tension, the resolution far better than sequences of neutral facts. A migration route is a sequence. A story turns that sequence into an epic. The hardship of crossing a desert becomes the hero's ordeal in the sun god's realm. The joy of finding an oasis becomes the moment the hero discovers a hidden garden. The story injects feeling into geography. You don't just know the path, you feel it. You anticipate the struggle and you long for the reward just as the characters did. That emotional investment is the glue. It makes the knowledge personal. It makes it yours. This encoding also made the knowledge adaptable. When a people moved to a new land with new rivers and new rocks, they didn't abandon their old map. They updated the story. The giant by the river might become a great bear by the mountain pass. The trickster god might now outwit a forest spirit instead of a water spirit. The narrative framework, the template of a challenge overcome near a specific landmark, remained perfectly functional. The story was a living file format. It could be opened and edited for a new environment while keeping all its essential navigational logic. The myth was the software, the new landscape was just the hardware it ran on. And this system survived the unthinkable. Wars, displacement, disasters, these can shatter a culture, scatter its people, destroy its physical records. But they have a harder time killing a story. A story can be carried in a single mind. It can be whispered in the dark. It can be sung when all else is lost. The narrative became the ultimate backup, stored not in a temple or on a tablet, but in the collective memory of the people. It was decentralized, resilient, portable. As long as one person remembered the tale of the long walk, of the star that led, of the whale that showed the way, the map could be recovered. The story was the seed from which the entire knowledge of a journey could grow back. So these myths were more than entertainment. They were a profound cognitive technology. They hacked the human mind's own strengths, our love for character, our resonance with emotion, our need for meaning, and used them to preserve the most vital information a community possessed. The story was the vessel and survival was the cargo, and that cargo was delivered intact across centuries. The land can be sung into being. That's what a songline is. Across Australia, Aboriginal cultures have kept this living atlas for tens of thousands of years. It's not a map you hold, it's a map you perform. Each songline is the story of an ancestral being, a creator spirit traveling across the land in the dreaming. And as it walked, as it sang, its actions formed the world. A footfall became a waterhole, a spear thrown became a mountain range, where it rested, a forest grew. The geography is the record of that sacred journey, so to know the songline is to know the route, and to travel that route you sing the song. The melody and lyrics describe every feature you'll encounter. The sequence of verses matches the sequence of landmarks. You sing of the rock that looks like a kangaroo, and there it is ahead of you. You sing of the dry riverbed where the ancestor dug for water, and you know to look for a hidden soak there. This is navigation as an act of creation. By singing the country, you're re-walking the creative path. You're maintaining the world's order with your voice. It's a functioning example of myth encoding precise knowledge, geographical knowledge, ecological knowledge. The song holds the data, where to find food, where water persists in a drought, where one clan's territory ends and another's begins. But it does more than that. This system shows a world view where law, and geography are inseparable. The songline is the title deed to the land. It's the historical record of its formation. It's the legal document outlining responsibilities, and it's the practical guide for survival. All in one, you can't separate the map from the myth. They are the same entity. So a young person learning a songline isn't just memorizing a route. They're learning their identity, their lore, their connection to every plant, every animal, every rock along the way. The knowledge isn't abstract, it's emplaced. It lives in the very soil underfoot. To walk a songline is to engage in a continuous ceremony. It keeps the knowledge alive not through rote repetition, but through sacred practice. The map is literally sung into existence during travel. Every journey becomes a reaffirmation of culture, a renewal of the land itself. This turns the whole continent into a web of stories, a resonant, interconnected web. A single songline might cross the territories of many different language groups. As travelers move from one country into another, they might change languages. But the melody remains the same. The next custodians will sing the next verse in their own tongue, continuing the narrative. The land itself provides the continuity. It's a system of staggering sophistication, of resilience, where the story is the ultimate conduit for knowledge, lasting far longer than any parchment could. A monster at the edge of the map was a sign. In so many traditions, the wilderness beyond the village had dragons, trolls, spirits. These weren't random fears. They were a communication system. A story about a dragon guarding a cave did two things. It marked that cave as a significant place, maybe a source of flint, a sheltered spot. And it communicated danger. Don't go there alone. Don't go there at night. The treasure was the resource. The dragon was the risk assessment. Think of the troll under the bridge. That's a territorial marker. A bridge is a choke point. Everyone has to pass through. A story about a troll living there demanding a toll encodes a practical reality. That crossing might be controlled by a rival group, or it might be structurally unsafe, needing a payment to a local guide. The myth turns a complex hazard into a simple rule. Don't cross that bridge without an offering, without permission. These narratives were ancient travel advisories. Before guidebooks, a community needed to say which valleys were safe for grazing and which mountain passes were death traps. You could just say, the North Pass has loose rock, but that's dry, it's forgettable. Instead, you tell the story of the stone gobbler in the North Pass. A creature that shakes the mountain when hungry, causing rocks to fall. Now the danger has a face, a name, a behavior. The information becomes unforgettable. The emotional hook of fear ensures the warning is passed down. A child remembers the monster long after they've forgotten a list of geological hazards. The flip side is the guardian spirit, a tale of a gentle giant protecting a forest or a water nymph ensuring a spring never runs dry. These stories marked safe havens. They indicated places of abundance or places under the protection of a local group. A valley watched over by a benevolent spirit was likely fertile, contested, sacred. The story was both an invitation and a rule. You are welcome here, but you must respect the spirit's laws. Don't overhunt, don't pollute the water. The myth enforced sustainable practice through narrative. We see this in Slavic tales of the Leshy, the forest spirit. It could be mischievous or helpful, leading travelers astray or guiding them to safety. The behavior of the Leshy in the story reflected the nature of the forest itself. A story of a Leshy helping a lost child might correspond to a part of the woods with clear paths, abundant berries. A story of a Leshy drowning people in swamps marked the actual location of bogland. The character of the spirit was a code for the character of the land. This system let nuanced information travel across generations, across language barriers. A migrating group meeting a new tribe might exchange stories, not maps. Hearing a legend about a fire-breathing worm in the eastern hills was a clear signal to avoid that route. Learning a song about the grandmother spirit who feeds travelers in the western meadow was an equally clear invitation. The mythology created a shared, symbolic language for terrain and risk. So these monster myths weren't primitive attempts to explain the unknown. They were a sophisticated data visualization tool. They turned abstract dangers, avalanches, territorial disputes, predatory animals into concrete characters with rules. They used the engines of fear and wonder to make sure the critical survival information stuck. The next time you hear an old fairy tale about a creature in a specific place, listen. It might not be a fantasy, it might be an ancient narrative-shaped signpost still pointing the way. A long winter can end a world. The Norse had a name for it, Fimbulwinter. 3 winters in a row with no summer between. That was the prelude to Ragnarok, the end of the gods, but it reads like a memory. A deep cultural memory of a time when the cold just wouldn't let go. About 12,800 years ago, the planet was warming, coming out of the last ice age. Then it reversed abruptly. For over 1,000 years, the temperatures plunged again. That period is called the Younger Dryas. Glaciers advanced, growing seasons got shorter. For hunter-gatherers living on the edge, this wasn't just a bad winter. It was an existential crisis, so the story of Fimbulwinter encodes that trauma. It turns a generations-long catastrophe into a narrative, a sun that fails. A cold that endures. The myth doesn't just record the event, it encodes the human response. In the saga, when the endless winter comes, it's a signal. It's the herald of the old world ending, and it creates this desperate need to find a new one. The story packages the cause and the solution together. The cause is the broken climate. The solution is movement, migration. We see this pattern. In the Andes, there are myths about the sun growing weak and hiding, bringing a great chill. In some Native American traditions, stories tell of a long darkness. The sun was stolen, and heroes had to journey to bring it back. These aren't just tales about the weather. They're allegories for survival. A volcanic eruption like the massive one at Lake Toba, tens of thousands of years ago, can shroud the planet in ash. That creates a volcanic winter lasting for years. An event like that would trigger a search, a desperate search for new lands where the sun still reached the ground. So the story of the lost sun becomes the story of that search. It turns a climatic trigger into a quest. The myth does this crucial psychological work. It takes a slow, grinding, impersonal disaster, a changing climate, and gives it a story arc. It has a beginning, the first unnatural snow, a middle, the struggle, the journey, and an end, the finding of the new land or the return of the sun. That structure is vital. It makes the unthinkable manageable. It gives people a role. They aren't just victims of a dying environment. They're the heroes on a quest to restore balance. The story teaches resilience not as a concept but as a plot. You must journey, you must adapt, you must find where life still persists. These myths also work as early warning systems. For future generations, by turning a past climate disaster into a legendary event, they create a cultural benchmark. If the signs appear again, unusual cold, failed crops, a dim sun, the elders can point to the story. They can say, "We have been here before, this is what the old ones spoke of, and this is what we must do." The story holds the protocol. When the endless winter comes, you gather what you can. You remember the direction the heroes went, and you move. So a legend about a stolen sun or an unending frost is more than a metaphor. It's a fossilized climate report. And a survival manual. It encodes the memory of a time when the very rules of the world changed, and the only way forward was to walk with hope into the unknown, following the faint memory of a warmer land. It tells us our ancestors weren't just survivors of climate change. They were its historians, writing their experience in the only indelible ink they had. A story too compelling to ever forget, the Earth Diver story. It's told from Siberia all the way to the Great Lakes. The world starts as just ocean, a vast ocean. And a creature is sent down, a muskrat or a loon, a turtle. It dives deep into the dark water, comes back with a little mud in its claws, in its beak. That bit of earth is placed on the water, and it starts to grow. It expands, it becomes the continent. The land is born from that dive, so you have this specific image. On both sides of the ocean, why? Comparative mythology sees it as a clue, a narrative fossil, from a time when those cultures weren't separate, the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Age. It was a plain connecting Asia and North America, a highway for animals, for people, and for stories. The Earth Diver myth could have been one of them. A story about origins, about the ground beneath their feet, told around fires as they moved into a new world. Then the Ice Age ended, the land bridge flooded. The people were separated, but the story stayed. It evolved in isolation for over 10,000 years. In North America, it became central to creation cycles. In Siberia, it persisted in shamanic traditions. The core stayed intact, the diver bringing land from water. That's not coincidence, it's a shared inheritance. You place these similar myths side by side, and sometimes you can trace a line on the map, a migration line preserved in plot points. There's another common thread. The star husband tale found across many Native American tribes. A woman marries a star, goes to live in the sky. She disobeys a taboo, looks down at earth, and falls back, sometimes down a rope of sinew. And a very similar story is told in Siberia. Again, the narrative bridge points to an ancient human bridge. Comparative study lets you reverse engineer. You look at the common elements, the cosmic marriage, the broken rule, the desperate return, and you ask what common experience this encodes. Could it be a memory of looking up at the same night sky from the same ancient land, a story about longing and belonging that traveled with the first families into the Americas? These parallels aren't about one culture copying another. They're about uncovering a deep ancestral layer, a narrative bedrock. Later, more localized myths grew from it. The global flood stories work on the same principle. You find where the stories overlap, and you can hypothesize about shared historical experiences. Cataclysmic events like rising seas that affected our ancestors on a planetary scale. This work is delicate. It requires respect. You're not simplifying distinct traditions. You're listening for a faint, common melody, one that might have been sung at the very beginning of the human journey. It suggests our oldest stories aren't just maps for a single tribe's migration. They're fragments of a world map, charting the earliest chapters of human dispersal itself, when the same strange, specific story appears on opposite sides of a mountain range or an ocean. It's worth asking if the story itself is the traveler, and if you follow its path back, you might just find where we all began. The descent into darkness is a common story. Inanna goes down to meet her sister Ereshkigal. Orpheus pleads in the halls of Hades. Izanami waits in the land of Yomi. These are underworld journeys. They speak of death, of loss, of testing courage, but they might also speak of the earth itself, of literal descents into the ground, remembered later as myth. Caves weren't just shelters, they were highways. In a landscape of open plains or dense forest, a cave system could offer a hidden route, a shortcut through a mountain, a secret passage to a valley on the other side. A volcanic lava tube formed by flowing rock creates a natural tunnel, sometimes for miles. For a group on the move, these weren't just geological features. They were strategic, and like any vital piece of survival knowledge, they got encoded into story. That terrifying journey into the underworld, past guardians, through darkness, to emerge reborn into the light, that could be the template for using subterranean geography. Take Inanna, the Sumerian goddess. She descends through 7 gates. She's stripped of her regalia at each one to face her dark sister. It's a spiritual allegory. But it also mirrors going deep underground. The 7 gates could be chambers or narrowing passages. Leaving belongings behind might reflect the need to travel light in a tight space. Her revival and return could symbolize using a cave system to bypass a surface danger, emerging into a new region. The myth makes the claustrophobic experience of cave travel into an epic of divine transformation. The Greek tale of Orpheus follows a similar arc. He goes down to retrieve his love, Eurydice. He must charm the guardians with his music. He's given one condition: don't look back until you reach the surface. He fails and she's lost. On one level, it's about grief and human frailty. On a practical level, it reads like a cautionary tale for cave navigation. The instruction not to look back could be a safety protocol. In a narrow, pitch-black tunnel, turning around could mean losing your footing, losing your way. Causing a rockfall, the story turns a critical rule into an unforgettable, tragic commandment. In Japan, the myth of Izanagi and Izanami tells of a creator god descending into Yomi, the land of the dead, to see his departed wife. He's horrified by her decay and flees, sealing the entrance with a great stone. This story encodes a taboo. The underworld is a place of pollution, of irreversible change. Once you go too far, you cannot return unchanged. This could preserve the very real danger of certain caves, places with bad air, underground rivers, unstable ceilings. The myth says this place is not for the living. It establishes a boundary protected by story. These narratives do something. They take the sensory experience of subterranean travel, the oppressive darkness, the echoing sounds, the disorientation, the final burst of light and open air, and give it a heroic framework. The journey through the underworld is the ultimate ordeal. It's the belly of the whale moment made literal, by framing it as a quest to retrieve something precious, a loved one, knowledge, power. The story provides the motivation to face that profound fear. It says this terrifying passage has a purpose. It leads to renewal. For a people on the move, a cave might have been the only way through a mountain range controlled by enemies. The only refuge from a surface event like a wildfire or a storm. The knowledge of its entrance, its internal turns, its far exit was priceless. That knowledge became a story of gods and monsters. The guardian at the gate might be a memory of a real physical obstacle, a territorial marker. The rule about not looking back might be the distilled wisdom of 100 successful passages. So when you hear an old tale about a hero going into the land of the dead, listen closely. Beyond the spiritual metaphor, you might be hearing the faint echoes of footsteps in a dark tunnel. The drip of water in a cavern, the collective sigh of relief as a tribe emerged once more into the welcoming light of a new day. The underworld wasn't just a metaphor for death. It was sometimes a map for life. The names on maps aren't just labels, they're the last lines of old stories written right across the land. Take the Amazon River. That name comes from Greek mythology, from stories about warrior women. European explorers thought they saw them along the banks. That naming wasn't just a reference. It was an act of cultural claiming, weaving a new, vast landscape into an old European story. The unfamiliar was made familiar through myth. The name stuck. And now when we say Amazon, we echo that collision, an ancient narrative meeting a new world. This pattern is everywhere. Athens carries the name of Athena, its patron goddess. A story of divine competition that defined the city. Rome's name is tied to Romulus, its mythic founder. In the Pacific, Hawaii is named for Hawaiiloa, the legendary navigator who found the islands. These names are more than history, they're fossilized in points, the end of migration stories, when a people arrived somewhere new after a long journey, naming that place after a hero or a god from their myths did something. It stitched this new geography into their cultural memory. The new land wasn't alien anymore, it was destined, the place the hero was seeking all along. You can trace journeys through these names. New Zealand's North and South Islands in Maori tradition are Te Ika e Moi, the fish of Moi, and Te Waka e Moi, his canoe. The names etch the story of the demigod fishing up the land right onto the map. To say the name is to recite a piece of the myth. It turns geography into a mnemonic. In Britain, countless rivers are called Avon. It just comes from an ancient Celtic word for river. But that repetition is itself a story. It shows a pattern of settlement. Each new community by a waterway used the same familiar word. The name was the story of what the place was, life-giving, central, a river. Even when the original meaning fades, the connection remains. The city of Oslo's name probably means the meadow at the foot of the hill. A simple, practical description of its founding location. That description was the story of why people settled there. The name encoded the reason. It was a good place, a flat place by the water, sheltered. That was the narrative. So the modern map is a palimpsest, a layered document. New roads and borders drawn over names that hold much older journeys. When you see a Mount Olympus in Washington State or an Ithaca in New York, you're seeing a later wave using the same tool. New settlers longing for connection named their new towns after the legendary places they left behind. They used myth to create instant routes, to build a bridge of narrative across an ocean. The name projects the old story onto the new soil, wills it into becoming a place of similar meaning. These names are quiet but powerful. They're the final act of the encoding process. The story that guided the journey ends by giving the destination a name from its own plot. and the land itself becomes a character in the ongoing legend. It is claimed not just by force or by fence, but by story, and that story, baked into every map and every signpost, continues to guide, to identify. To remind us that every place we stand was once someone's new beginning, immortalized in a name. The Navajo, the Diné, have a creation story. It's not one world, but 5. It starts deep below in a series of underworlds. Each one has its own color, its own people, its own reason to leave. The first world was black. It became crowded. The second world was blue, and conflict arose there. The third world was yellow, and a great flood came. The fourth world was white or glistening, and still it wasn't the final home. In each world, the people learned, they adapted, and when conditions became untenable, they found a way upward. They climbed. Through a hollow reed or a giant bamboo, they emerged into the fifth world. The glittering world, this one, to hear it is a spiritual epic, but scholars, listening with the ear of ethnogeography, hear something else woven in. They hear a map, a profound, layered encoding of the Diné ancestors' own long migration, from the subarctic regions of northwestern Canada down to the deserts of the American Southwest. Each of those previous worlds likely represents a distinct stage in that centuries-long journey. The story compresses time and distance into symbolic realms. It preserves the memory of the path. The first world, the Black World, could correspond to the early homeland in the far north, a place of dark winters, of dense boreal forests. The reason for leaving: overcrowding, discord, might reflect the social and resource pressures that began the migration south. And the journey upward through the reed to the next world mirrors the physical passage out of that territory. The blue world and the yellow world that follow could symbolize the Great Plains or the intermontane basins, the blue of vast skies, the yellow of sun-scorched grasslands. The story mentions specific trials: a flood sent by angry gods, the people learning to live with new elements. These narrative events may encode real environmental challenges. A devastating flood along a major river, the struggle to find water in arid basins. The lessons learned were survival strategies mythologized into divine commandments. Finally, the emergence into the fifth world through the reed is not just a creation moment. It's likely the arrival in the Diné's promised homeland, the Colorado Plateau. The description of this world as glittering or changing captures the Southwest. The way light plays on canyon walls, the sparkle of mica in sandstone. The specific sacred mountains that bound the Diné homeland are established here as the pillars of existence. The story sanctifies the very coordinates of their arrival. This narrative is a spiritual map of historical migration. It preserves the vector from north to south, from below to above. It preserves the challenges, the social strife, the climatic hardships. And it preserves the destination not as a random plot of land, but as a world earned through perseverance. The story makes the migration a sacred journey of becoming. Each world left behind was a necessary step, preparing them for the responsibility of stewarding their final, glittering home. To know the story is to know, in your soul, where you came from, and how you belong to the land you now walk. It turns history into identity and geography into scripture. The stars told farmers when to stay, when to stop moving. For people who lived between wandering and settling, the most important thing to know wasn't just the place. It was the time to put seeds in the ground and believe they would come up. The sky gave them that schedule, and the stories made sure they remembered it. There's the story of Demeter and Persephone. The harvest goddess loses her daughter to the underworld, and the earth goes cold. Barren, when the daughter returns, Demeter's joy brings back the spring, the summer. But this isn't just a pretty story about why seasons change. It's a farming manual. Persephone going down is the sowing, the seed buried in the dark earth. Her time in the underworld is the seed germinating, hidden her return is the green shoot breaking through. That's the signal the earth can bloom again. The myth takes this whole cycle of dormancy and growth, this abstract year, and turns it into a family story. Loss and reunion, that makes the planting time impossible to forget. For herders, the timing was different, just as critical. Knowing the exact week to move the flocks up the mountain, that was the difference. Between herds that thrived and herds that starved, and that date was often pinned to a star's rising, the heliacal rising of the Pleiades. For many cultures that was the signal. In Greece it meant the sailing season began. For the ancient Celts, for steppe peoples, that same cluster appearing meant it was time. Time to drive the animals up to the summer pastures. The myth that grew up around those stars, often calling them a flock of sheep or celestial cattle, that was the reminder. You didn't need a written almanac, you needed to remember the story. The 7 sisters chased across the sky. When you saw them first appear at dawn, you knew. The story and the event were fused, a cultural alert system. This encoding did more than give a date. It created a loop, a sustainable loop between what people did and the natural world. By tying their most crucial acts, planting, moving to the clockwork of the heavens, these cultures built something, a system that resisted short-term mistakes. A leader couldn't just decide to plant early. The story said to wait for the sign. The myth enforced patience. It aligned human effort with deeper rhythms. Ecological rhythms, it was a form of long-term climate adaptation, baked right into narrative. The story made sure the community's movement through the year was synchronized. Synchronized with the land's capacity to support them, it turned survival into a ceremony. The calendar became a sacred story, and that story fed everyone. A map made of symbols, you can't read it like a signpost. The old storytellers weren't giving you directions to follow blind. They worked in metaphor. They wrapped practical knowledge inside a symbol. A sea serpent in a tale, that's not an animal you could find. It's the churning danger of a particular stretch of water, and the hero who beats it isn't recording a fight. It's the technique, the way you get through that hazard. If you take the symbol as the literal path, you've broken the code. You're looking at a treasure map and trying to spend the drawing of the chest. The value was never in the monster, it was in the meaning behind it, and to get that meaning you need a key. That key is cultural context. For the people who carried the story, the interpretation was taught. An elder would explain, when we speak of the giant sleeping in the northern pass, we mean the avalanche danger. When the snow is deep, the symbols were a shared language. A language that outsiders without the key would hear as fantasy. They might hear about a magical grove and just see trees. They'd miss that the story was a boundary marker. Or a conservation law. The skill was in the weaving. The storyteller took the hard date. This river bends here. This mountain pass is only safe in late summer. This star rises when the fish run, and spun it into a narrative. A narrative of gods and trials. The data was the thread, the myth was the tapestry, and only those who knew how the loom worked could look at the picture and see the threads for what they were. This is why you have to be careful with comparative mythology. Finding a dragon story in Europe and a similar serpent story in Asia doesn't mean someone saw the same creature. It might mean both cultures faced a similar kind of challenge. A treacherous water crossing, a narrow defile where ambushes were likely, and they used the same powerful symbolic animal to represent that abstract danger. The symbol is universal because the category of challenge is universal, but the specific instruction is local. It's tied to a real bend in a real river. So when you hear an old myth, listen for the code under the plot. Don't ask, did this happen? Ask, what does this represent? What real-world trial is this magical ordeal standing in for? What landscape feature is this talking tree actually describing, or this weeping rock? The story is a locked chest, a chest of ancestral knowledge. The rituals, the songs, the elders' teachings, they're the combination. And when you learn to think in symbols, you start to hear the ancient world differently, not as a collection of superstitions, but as a conversation. A continuous, whispering conversation between a people and the land they called home. Decoding a living map, it's a different kind of navigation. You take modern tools to these ancient stories, but you're not just analyzing text. You're engaging with a living system. For many indigenous cultures, these narratives aren't folklore from the past. They're active, sacred knowledge. They are the framework of law, identity, survival. To treat them as historical artifacts, as puzzles for outsiders to solve, that misses their purpose. It extracts the data but ignores the spirit that gives it life. The ethical approach is partnership, not possession. It means listening to the knowledge keepers, the elders, the rightful custodians of these narrative maps. It means recognizing the story isn't ours to take. It's to be invited to understand with permission and deep respect. That shifts the entire endeavor. You move from seeing myths as quaint, primitive tales to recognizing them as sophisticated intellectual traditions. They are systems of science developed over millennia of observation, encoded for resilience. The knowledge inside them, seasonal cycles, ecological relationships, celestial navigation, it represents a parallel path of discovery, one that sustained human societies in balance with their environments for thousands of years. A songline details the flowering of a plant and the arrival of an animal, and it's recording precise ecological data. A creation story describes the formation of a canyon, and it may be preserving geological history. This isn't metaphor, not in the way we often think. It's a different mode of transmitting complex, interconnected information. To appreciate it, you have to set aside your own cultural biases about what constitutes valid science or history. The wisdom in these systems is vast. It offers insights into sustainable living, into wayfinding without technology, into deep time relationships with place. We're only beginning to grasp its depth, but that grasping has to be done with an open hand, not a closed fist. It requires acknowledging these stories as a form of intellectual property, belonging to the cultures that nurtured them. The goal of this deciphering shouldn't be to claim we've cracked the code for the world. It should be to humbly learn from it, to understand how different ways of knowing can guide us toward a more thoughtful relationship with our planet and our past. When you listen to these stories with respect, you're not just hearing a tale. You're receiving an invitation to see the world through a different, deeply connected lens. The shape of an island can be a story. It can be a story about a fish. For the Maori, the North Island of New Zealand is Te Ika e Moe, the great fish of the demigod Maui. In the myth, Maui is fishing with his brothers. He catches a tremendous fish, and when it's pulled to the surface, it becomes the island. The fish's head is the southern peninsula. Its tail is the north, the eastern and western capes are its fins. This isn't a vague metaphor. It's a precise geographical description. It's encoded in a tale of divine fishing. The story explains the land's origin, and it gives every bay and headland a place in a sacred narrative. To know the myth is to hold a mental map of the entire coast. A map crafted not with lines but with legend. This pattern is the rule. Nearly every creation myth is hyper-local. It describes the specific world its people inhabit. The mountains outside your village aren't random piles of stone. They're the petrified bodies of ancestral giants, or the thrown weapons of clashing gods. The river that winds through your valley is the path of a fleeing serpent, or the tears of a sky spirit. These stories anchor a people to their land. They answer the child's question, why is that mountain there? Not with geology, but with genealogy. The land becomes family, it becomes history, but what happens when you must leave that land? When migration or conflict or climate forces a people to walk away from the mountains they know as giants, away from the rivers they know as serpents. This is where the creation myth reveals its second function. It becomes portable. It becomes a blueprint, a narrative seed from which a new homeland can be grown. By carrying the story of how their world was first made, a migrating group carries the instructions for how to make a world again. They can perform a symbolic recreation in a new place. Arriving in an unfamiliar valley, they would look for correspondences. This new river may not be the old river, but it can be like the river in the story. It can be given the same role in the narrative. That hill over there can be reinterpreted as the resting place of the ancestor. The story provides a flexible template, a way to map the familiar sacred geography onto the new, physical one. It's an act of profound cognitive wayfinding. The myth allows them to say, "We are not lost. We are in the new version of the world our ancestors sang into being. We are home because our story is here." We see this in the biblical Exodus. The story of a people leaving one land for another is framed by a creation narrative. Genesis establishes their God as the shaper of the world itself. This portable cosmology meant their sense of sacred order wasn't tied to the pyramids of Egypt or the rivers of Mesopotamia. It could be carried in a tent, in an ark. It could be projected onto the hills of Canaan. Their God was not a local deity of a specific mountain. He was the creator of all mountains, which meant he could sanctify any new mountain they encountered. This is the ultimate act of encoded navigation. The creation myth charts a course not through space but through meaning. It guides a people to a state of belonging. It turns the terrifying process of displacement into a sacred journey of recreation. The land you find may be new, but the story you use to understand it is ancient, and in that story you will always know where you are. You will always know who you are. Because the map of your world is written in the oldest tale you own. The blueprint is in our cells. We carry the map of ancient migrations in our DNA. Population genetics studies human variation. It's become a kind of time machine. It lets scientists read the faint signatures our ancestors left as they moved across continents over tens of thousands of years. They trace these paths by comparing specific markers in the genetic code of living people from different regions. The patterns of similarity and difference reveal a family tree. It shows who is related to whom and when their paths likely diverged. It's a molecular map of our global dispersal, and this map, drawn from biology, is starting to tell a story that sounds familiar. It's converging with the oldest maps we have, the ones held in mythology. The evidence is becoming startling. Take the Great Austronesian Expansion, the peopling of the Pacific. For generations, scholars used linguistics and archaeology to trace this voyage from Taiwan, through island Southeast Asia, out to the remotest corners of the Pacific. The oral histories spoke of it. The legends of the navigator Maui charted it. Now, genetic studies of modern Polynesian populations confirm it. The DNA shows a clear trail of ancestry leading back through the island chains. The sequence matches the order of settlement preserved in the oral traditions. The genes and the stories are reading from the same logbook. They confirm the epic myths of fishing up islands weren't just metaphors. They were narrative records of a real, generational journey carried in the canoes and in the very bodies of the voyagers. In the Americas, similar convergences are unfolding. Many Native American oral traditions describe origins from a distant place, often across water or from within the earth. For a long time, mainstream science offered a separate narrative based on archaeology. But recent genetic research has added profound depth. Studies show all indigenous peoples of the Americas share a common ancestral population that branched off from groups in Siberia. The genetic data suggests this branching, this journey across the ancient Bering Land Bridge, happened in distinct pulses, and remarkably, some of these genetic pulses seem to align with cultural and linguistic divisions remembered in various tribal histories. The stories of emerging from a series of underworlds, like the Navajo narrative, or of a long journey following a spirit animal now find a parallel in the branching lines of a genetic family tree. It doesn't validate every detail of a sacred story, but it creates a powerful resonance. It suggests the deep memory of a monumental migration of leaving one world and entering another was preserved and passed down for millennia, encoded in culture. This partnership between genetics and mythology is rewriting history, not as a conflict between science and tradition, but as a chorus. Each voice fills in gaps the other cannot. Genetics can provide the when and the where with precision, but it is silent on the why. It can show a population moved, but not what they felt, what they hoped for, what they feared on that journey. Mythology provides the why. It gives us the emotional and psychological landscape. The story of a flood that forced a people to seek high ground gives meaning to a genetic signal of population displacement after sea levels rose. The legend of a hero leading a tribe to a promised land gives a narrative shape to a genetic trail showing a group splitting off and founding a new community. Together, they are weaving a richer, more human story of us. It's a story where our biological inheritance and our cultural inheritance are not separate streams, but two currents in the same river of time. Our ancestors moved, and their genes recorded the fact of the journey. Their experiences on that journey, the challenges, the discoveries, the profound changes, they wove into story. One is the record of the body, the other is the record of the soul, and now we are learning to listen to both at once. We are discovering the epic of human exploration was written twice. Once in the nucleus of every cell, and once around the fires of 1,000 generations. And both versions, it turns out, are telling the truth. Mythology was the first navigation system. The first atlas, not written on parchment, but in the rhythm of stories told around a fire. We've traveled across that hidden map, from the star paths of Polynesian voyagers to the sung landscapes of the Dreamtime. From the flood warnings of our ancestors to the genetic echoes in our own cells, these narratives were never just fiction. They were vessels, sophisticated vessels, built to carry the most vital data a people could have. The path home, the route forward, the living memory of where they'd been. Every monster was a landmark. Every hero's ordeal, a waypoint, every creation story, a map of belonging. Our ancestors looked at a chaotic world, an untamed world, and they did something extraordinary. They wove it into a story. They turned rivers into serpents, mountains into giants, star clusters into ancestral campfires, and in doing that, they created a guide that was resilient, transmissible, unforgettable. A guide that could survive the collapse of empires, the loss of homelands, the passage of 1,000 years. This points to a truth. Mythology isn't opposed to history. It isn't opposed to science. It's their precursor, their partner. It was the first attempt to record observation, to understand cause and effect, to chart a course through an uncertain universe. Those ancient storytellers were the first cartographers, the first astronomers, the first ecologists. They encoded their hard-won knowledge in the only medium guaranteed to last. A compelling narrative. So as we end this, consider the stories you carry, the family legends, the local tales, the old sayings about a particular hill or a bend in the road. What forgotten maps might they hold? What subtle directions are woven into their plot? If this journey has reshaped your view of the past, if you now hear an echo of ancient footsteps in your favorite old myth, share your thoughts, subscribe for more journeys into the unknown corners of history and human imagination, and remember, the next time you hear an old story, listen a little closer. It might not be just a tale.